Hi, everybody. Today I'm going to be presenting joint work that I carried out with Wittenberg, where we use a novel experimental paradigm to investigate discourse structure effects on reference to events, both of which the discourse structure and the event reference have been very hard to pin down experimentally before. So that is exciting. That's going to be a fun part of this. But to get started, all right, here we have a small piece of discourse that's been taken out of a larger set of instructions. At the end of it is a clause containing the referring expression that. So if I were to ask you, what does that refer to? I think you'll find that the reference is ambiguous. It could refer to the last event mentioned, the viewing the PDF, or the last two, the changing the file extension and viewing the PDF, or all three together. Well, to begin with, let's just assume a flat discourse structure. This is the type of structure that you would probably expect for a narrative list, just a list of things you're doing in order. Right? So one prominent account about which parts of a discourse are available for reference is the right frontier constraint. What it says really is that only nodes on the right frontier of a discourse structure are available for reference. Now, by right frontier, what it means is that part of the structure that can be traced in a straight line from the last node, here node 3, to the root node, here node 1, 2, 3. Right? So for this structure, the right frontier constraint would predict that only the last event, node 3, or all three events, node 1, 2, 3, should be available for reference. But as we just saw, at least in this example, it seems that this constraint is violable because you could have it being just nodes 2 and 3 to the exclusion of node 1. So that is, reference is possible not only to the last event or the whole discourse, but also to an internal event. So what could be guiding event reference evolution if it's not the right frontier? To help us try to figure this out, we're going to take a look at some parallel situations in the domain of reference to people. So one factor that has been shown to affect reference to people is the amount of linguistic material associated with a referent. Elaborating material like this, such as alleged Venezuelan in the bottom red example, has been shown to facilitate referent retrieval at the gap site, so where band is. And this has been shown in the form of faster reading times when compared to non-elaborated examples like the one we have in blue, where it's just communist, no alleged Venezuelan. So, and also it's worthwhile to note that this effect can be found even when the elaborative material occurred in a prior sentence. So it can be interstential. So the idea of elaboration can be straightforwardly applied to our discourse structure that we're working with, right? So on the left here, we see our simple structure from before, where it's essentially flat. Right? And we can create an elaborated structure by further describing an event. So in this case, by further describing the event at node 2, right? So we elaborate on change the extension by describing its constituent subevents, namely right-clicking the file, selecting rename, and replacing the extension. So we want to ask, do comprehenders do comprehenders choose elaborated internal events as a referent more often than simple internal events, so ones that aren't elaborated? If elaborations don't have any effect on referent choice, we would expect results like we see here, where the proportions are remaining steady in both conditions. But if elaborated material for internal events are chosen more often, we would expect the results that we see here on the right, where the proportion of elaborated is higher. So what we did was we conducted 2 experiments using a novel paradigm designed to investigate discourse structure and event reference. Both experiments had 160 participants that we recruited from Amazon Mechanical Turk. There were 12 critical stimuli for each one and 24 fillers in the form of sets of instructions. Half of the critical stimuli had simple structure, half had elaborated structure. Additionally, you can see here, for reasons that will become clear a few slides in the future, that we also have half of the criticals with perfective aspect and half with imperfective aspect. So the only difference between the 2 experiments, experiment 1 and 2, is that the first experiment used nominal referring expressions it and that, while the second experiment used the adverbial referring expressions so and thus. The choice of referring expressions is not really relevant to the current discussion, so I'm going to collapse over them for this talk. If you have questions about it, feel free to ask in the Q&A. And both experiments were replications of previous in-lab experiments that we had done that showed similar patterns. So here we have an example of the task, so you can see it. What you have is participants see the steps of the instructions on the left, and there's this corresponding Gantt chart on the right. And most of the charts are already populated by these blue cells. They're fixed, can't do anything with them. But the underlined steps in the instructions correspond to these interactive red cells, which can be moved left or right, and they can be expanded or contracted. Participants would place the red cells according to their understanding of how the corresponding steps fit into the structure. Before starting the actual experiment, they all underwent 4 training sets of instructions that they had to get perfectly right before they could move on. And they got more or less customized feedback based on the type of errors they made. And most of them got it in the first 3 or 4 tries, they figured it out. So they were able to learn how to do this pretty quickly. Now, this particular set of instructions, let's start over again, is representing an elaborated structure. It's depicted by the long blue cells with the elaborations underneath. The first 3 red cells are distractors. It's only the last red cell that we are interested in. It corresponds to a step that contains the referring expression, in this example, having done so. When participants place the corresponding red cell, they place it to correspond with the steps that they take the referring expression to be referring to, right? They could choose only the most recent step, they could choose all of the preceding steps, or any other continuous grouping of steps in there. What we did was we tracked which steps they chose as our dependent variable. Right? In this example, we have the five previous steps being chosen that correspond to an elaborated internal event viewing the PDF. So the results from the first experiment look like this. We found a significant effective structure with elaborated internal events being chosen more often than simple internal events. So just as we had predicted. And then results for the second experiment show a very similar pattern, right? Both of these are going the way that our hypothesis had predicted that they would, where you're finding a higher proportion of internal events being selected for elaborated structures versus simple structures. So similar to how elaborative material facilitates reference to people, it also facilitates reference to events. Now, our second factor that's been shown to affect reference to people is grammar-guided event construal. And what I mean by that is, in this situation, the aspect that's used has an effect on comprehenders' expectations about subsequent reference. So for example, with verbs of transfer, such as hand, they focus attention sort of by default on the end state of the transfer. Because of this, comprehenders expect continuations to be about the goal of the transfer, in this case, marrying. Excuse me. However, when the verb has imperfective aspect, the probability of a continuation being about the source increases. It's still biased towards the goal, but it goes up for the source. The probability does, sorry. So a similar pattern is also found when both possible referents are the same gender. So you get a he, and it's ambiguous between whether it's the source or the goal. So in trying to apply this idea to discourse, or our discourse, what we've done is we embedded the referring expression under the perfective aspect. So here, having done that, where done is the perfective form of do. And then also the imperfective aspect, as in doing that. What we want to know is if imperfective aspect facilitates referential access to the internal events in the discourse structure. So we ask, do comprehenders choose internal events as the referent more often when the referring expression is embedded under imperfective aspect when compared to perfective aspect? So first, we're going to take a look at discourse with simple structure. Okay. If there's no effect of aspect on referent choice, we expect something like this, where everything is relatively stable across both conditions. Okay. But if imperfective aspect leads to internal events being chosen more often, we would expect results like this on the right. Right. So in the first experiment, we found a significant effective aspect with internal events being chosen more often when the referring expression was embedded under imperfective aspect. And then the results for the second experiment show a very similar pattern. And again, both results are conforming to our hypothesis. But we can also go a little further and ask, well, what about structure that contains both elaborated and simple internal events? Right? They don't all have to be elaborated. You can have one of each or any combination. Right? So now we have two different types of internal events that are available for reference. So imperfective aspect may lead to internal events being chosen more often, and elaborated internal events may be chosen more often than simple internal events. If it's not the case, we'll expect again something like this, where the proportions stay the same across both conditions. But if we're on the right track, we should expect to see results like this, where the internals go up, or the internal events go up, elaborated internal events even more so. So in the first experiment, we found a significant effective aspect with internal events being chosen more often when the referring expression was embedded under imperfective aspect. In particular, while the overall proportion of internal events chosen increased with imperfective aspect, it was only the proportion of elaborated internal events that increased. The proportion of simple internal events actually decreased. And once again, we got very similar results in the second experiment. Both experiments having results going in the direction our hypothesis predicted. So similar to how aspect guides event construal with regard to individual participants in a single event, aspect also guides event construal with regard to individual events in a larger complex event, such as a discourse. So in sum, we found that participants chose internal events as the referent more often when they contained elaborations and when the referring expression was embedded under imperfective aspect. Now let's go back to the right frontier constraint. It makes strong predictions that the only events on the right frontier of the discourse structure are available for reference. But that is just not the case. We have seen that both an elaborated discourse structure and imperfective aspect can increase the odds that a comprehender will take a referring expression to be referring to some part of the structure that is not on the right frontier. Both of these factors can be thought of as affecting the accessibility of a referent. Elaborative material has been proposed to increase a reference accessibility by increasing its level of activation and working memory. An imperfective aspect has long been thought of as allowing for an internal perspective on events. It's reasonable to believe that such a perspective increases the accessibility of internal reference, be they people or events. it may be then that the seeming requirement that reference be to an event on the right frontier is just epiphenomenal. Perhaps all things being equal, the right frontier is just the most accessible part of the structure, but all things are not always equal. When we manipulate accessibility with elaborations or imperfective aspect, the constraint becomes more of a preference. I see at least one possible way to salvage the constraint, and that is to allow for accessibility-driven restructuring of the discourse. Yeah, most theories that I am familiar with of discourse already allow for updating of the discourse structure, right? Based on the current perception of discourse relations as the discourse is unfolding. So the same could conceivably be done based on changing levels of accessibility as well, with what I've been calling internal events being restructured so as to move to the right frontier. I'm not sure how viable this possibility is, but it is out there. And lastly, I just want to briefly discuss our task. Studying event reference and discourse structure has been very problematic and hard to tackle given the experimental tools that we've had at our disposal. We've developed this paradigm that we used here to overcome this barrier to experimental investigation of events and discourse. It's been shown to produce useful and importantly replicable results, and will hopefully lead to many more fruitful investigation into these areas in the future. With that, I want to say thank you, and also to thank the wonderful RAs from UCSD's Language Comprehension Lab. I can't say all their names, so I just put them up here. Thank you very much, and I'll take whatever questions you might have.